Thanks very much, and second time up, so I hope I do a good job. And I want to really say that I want to generate a lot of discussion for this because I'm not going to fill the time slot. I think my brief was to try and raise some of the, not necessarily concerns, but some of the things that people are thinking about with this increased popularity with regenerative agriculture. And I was pleased that at least two of the speakers this morning focused on definitions and what did their little area work. And if we're having difficulty just describing one little thing about biofertilisers, just imagine where we're at having a difficulty describing a whole system of regenerative agriculture. So I think I put this chart up yesterday. I'm going to concentrate again just on the wheat belt area in terms of where I get to in terms of talking about trials and how we might design things. Regenerative agriculture has a very broad catch-all, which would include much of our rangelands, which is this sort of dark green or light green colour, where we have very low populations of cattle and some sheep grazing as well. So I'm going to avoid that part of it, the talk in the talk today. Again, just this slide that you saw yesterday, not only our wheat belt soils are highly variable, but also the soils over the rest of Western Australia are highly variable as well. They have, I guess, coexisted with animals that don't have hard feet. They don't have hooves, the kangaroos and all the other animals that are there, soft feet, delicate soils, ancient soils. So there's an aspect of regenerative agriculture there that needs to maintain and look after those soils. I guess the first question is, why have we almost suddenly or very recently got very interested in regenerative agriculture? I think it's a term, and the word sexy's been used a couple of times. I think it's probably a little bit of an element of that. There's a catch-all term that people think, and we've heard today, healthy soil, healthy crops, healthy people. And our urban population is definitely looking for that healthy connection and that increase in health, and it's associated with perhaps being able to produce that off our farming systems. So, probably quite rightly so, there's a concern with the high chemical usage in some of the conventional agricultural systems that we've got, and the reliance on that, a reliance on herbicides. Now that we're in a no-till situation, that's become much more prevalent. Talked about health and safety. In Western Australia, we've got because everybody's got Twitter or Facebook or social media, anybody is able to make a comment on whatever they feel like. You don't have to be qualified to make a comment. My comment's as loud as somebody else's comment, and from that point of view. So there's a public scepticism of science and of big business that's just out to make money and not necessarily around those healthier sort of guidelines that we would like to think of. I think there's also, on the positive side of things, there's a much wider recognition of our soils. I think it started with the Food and Agricultural Organisation's book in 2015, I think it was, that talked about the world soils resources. It's a massive publication. It's well worth having a look at if you're interested in soils and if you're interested in soils around the world and how they're being managed. Part of the work that I talked about yesterday was actually used as a case study for the Asia-Australasia area in terms of how we manage the aspects of soil acidity. So that's generated, that started as the International Year of Soils. Each year we have a World Soils Day on December the 5th. I'm sure it's celebrated here as well. And what generated from that first International Year of Soils was a decade of soils. So it's sort of sustaining that, no pun intended, but it's sustaining that information and interest and in soils. So to try and get to what is regenerative agriculture, look at the words there. It's an application of techniques. Doesn't define techniques. It's got a collection of techniques that seek to restore landscape function and deliver outcomes that include, as you can see from the dot points there. Now, coming from Western Australia, well, from a regenerative aspect, there's an assumption that agriculture has degraded the soil. I would put it to you that the work that we've done in improving the nutrition of Western Australian soils has actually put them into a better position than they were initially. So they're able to grow crops, we're able to farm them. That's not to say we haven't done some of the things that I'll cover in a moment. But I think we should also think about regenerative agriculture, whatever definition we end up trying to use for it. We should be looking at it as conservation farming, no-till farming, sustainable agriculture, conventional farming. They're all on one continuum, and at one end you'll have people that are more fixed and focused on some extremes, and you'll have some extremes at the other. And I think overall we could try and make it that regenerative agriculture takes the best aspects of all of those systems and puts them together into whatever system is most suitable for the soil. This is a sort of some of the practices that are, I guess, promoted. There's definitely a leaning towards more biological processes in terms of regenerative practices, but to drive carbon cycling, soil fertility and water use efficiency. And those are all the things that we've been talking about the last day and a half. They look to do that through retaining soil cover and minimising soil disturbance, all of the things that we've again been talking about for most of the day. Encouraging diversity, that's probably something that conventional agriculture doesn't do as much with our monocultures and our relatively narrow rotation systems. Another thing, certainly from Western Australia, that's apparent and sort of at odds with some of the more general descriptions is the reintroduction of animals into the system. So a legume pasture with sheep and animal grazing, even some crop grazing perhaps, prior to it growing for harvest. Many of our farmers have moved to 100% cropping and don't have animals on the farm. They've removed fences and watering spots and all of those sorts of things. Obviously, as I've already said, there's an emphasis on reduced herbicides and to use more biological things, and we've heard about those this morning as well. The Perth Natural Resource Management organisation in Western Australia has put their own definition there, which I'm sure you've read by now. But just draw your mind to the point at the bottom there. It's probably one of the more extreme requirements or desires is to have 100% cover 100% of the time. And wherever possible, they want that to be green cover, living roots and living systems. Now, obviously in our winter-dominated rainfall and very dry summers, very sandy soils, that's a very hard ask to try and achieve. I think it's important to recognise that many of the practices that regenerative farming advocates talk about are already being practiced by the best farmers. You know, we use minimum tillage for all of those things that are written there. We use stubble retention wherever possible. Perennial pastures on soils that are suitable that aren't suitable for rotational cropping. Some grasses which are active or do actually stay alive and then respond to and give quick feed availability if there's a summer rainfall, for example, which does happen on occasions. We look definitely at groundwater usage and the contour farming on areas where they are, and I see that you guys do much the same as well. Land use planning is a term that's used to try and put the agriculture or the horticulture or the animal husbandry practices on soils that are suitable for that won't be degraded by those various farming aspects. So we try and put the agricultural practices or agricultural systems where they're best suited. I guess the other option is the practices that restore or maintain the fertility that we've got. And we've talked about those today and over the last couple of days, like lime and gypsum as well. So that all sounds pretty positive. So why am I standing here having a feeling that certainly from an Australian perspective with our conventional farmers, why is there a resistance to change? Why is there a resistance to adopt these practices that seem, relatively straightforward and actually make quite a bit of sense? I think the first thing is that there's a lack of scientific validation. We have not been out there and compared System A versus System B, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So we don't have that scientific validation, or we haven't got the information that gives farmers the confidence that they can take a year out of 4 out of production to grow a cover crop, for example, and return that to the soil, but still after 1 or 2 4-year rotations, they'll be better off. It's difficult to change an already profitable system. As I showed yesterday, the farmers, even the ones that are doing only some of the things properly, are still making money, and good money given the hectares that they're farming. I guess the thing that's important about animals, and the reasons that animals came out of the system, is they were less profitable and they were hard work. With a farm business workforce of maybe half a dozen at the most, looking after 4,000 to 6,000 hectares. If you've got animals on the farm, they need year-round attention. It doesn't give the family an opportunity to take off on a holiday and get a break that they need after farming the things, unlike if they were just having a single cash crop each year. Our labour is hard to source, and good labour is hard to source, and it's also expensive. So that, again, works against having an integrated animal system on the farm. Before we know where to go in terms of building up the soil, or deciding whether it's degraded or what needs to happen, which practices are best to adopt to improve it, we first need to have at least some assessment of the current situation and what it looks like. Now, in 2013, we brought together a lot of different aspects of information on managing the natural resources, mainly through the agricultural area. There's been another publication for those pastoral lands that I mentioned. And we put the best information that we had together to look at the current trends in resource condition. There's a declining, improving, and as much as we could, depending on the level of data that we had, we were able to do that at more detailed or more broad levels, depending on the aspect that we were looking at. So things that we've got some idea of, soil acidity, obviously, we've been involved, and we probably know the most about that in terms of our level of understanding about how it's improving or declining across the grain belt. Soil compaction, we've had some fairly significant projects, and most of the information comes from survey data in terms of machinery size and adoption of controlled traffic, so we have a fair idea how that's going. Soil water repellents, we also have a reasonable level of information on that. And soil nutrient status through the laboratories that do the tests, we have a good idea of where the nutrients are heading, up or down, across a fairly detailed picture of that. Less so for soil organic carbon. I think we understand the processes and we understand the general trends, but the work that has been done, and it's difficult to do, has only been done on isolated areas. So we're actually trying to extend that information across much broader areas, which obviously have some greater level of uncertainty involved in it. Salinity, we have fairly good understandings of that because we can get good impressions from satellites about where the areas of the land affected. As the same for wind and water erosion, we're using remote sensing to give us trends on that, tied in with seasonal weather conditions and rainfall across the different areas of the grain belt. So we have a reasonable idea where we're starting, and I think we can use that to move forward and set some priorities. A definition which I quite liked is on a website which is run by the University of Western Australia. So a healthy soil is a soil that is productive, easy to manage under the intended land use. It has biological, physical and chemical properties that promote health of animals, plants and humans, while also maintaining the environmental quality. And our scientific, Commonwealth Scientific Organisation has added some dot points to that sort of definition, which I think are useful. We're either preventing or repairing any land degradation. We're maintaining the original and inherent qualities of the ecosystem, And we're also, and this is where the bit about improving the nutrients comes in, we're improving the ability for food and fibre production. And clearly the photograph that I've used there, which is a wheat belt picture, showing the effect of prefrontal winds on land that has been left bare, probably due to overgrazing. It's a common, we get winds that come through before the rainfall, and you end up getting some dust storms. And I'm sure you've probably heard of other dust storms in the eastern wheat belt that get far more coverage because they actually dump dust and dirt onto Melbourne and Sydney, and with a lot more people there, it's actually blown away from the people in Perth, so they probably don't really know much about it. I won't dwell on this slide because I think we've talked about many of these aspects and many of the measurements, but again, after some of the talks today, or yesterday and today, I think I probably should have drawn this more as a triangle, because it's definitely a 3-point system with those additional inputs that drive a lot of it from the climate, will drive the productivity, and the agricultural management also drives the productivity as well. But all of those things are things that we should be looking at, and there's no surprises there, I don't think. So what's our approach to regenerative agriculture? I think we've got 3 aspects. We have to provide some answers and some information to growers. I don't think it's going to come quickly, because we are definitely looking at the impact of different rotations, and we must be looking at those in each year, but I'll come to the design in a minute. So long-term field trials is the main area that I'll be involved in helping to advise and get people working on. So it's one thing I really would like some discussion happening on. The other thing is case studies, and then opportunities for niche marketing of products that have been grown under a regenerative farming label. Just firstly, in case studies, there's a website there called Soils for Life. It's eastern states based, but it does have case studies from around Australia. In Western Australia, we have 2. One from a farming enterprise, which is actually called Prospect Pastoral Company, but it's a farming enterprise, as opposed to a more pastoral station location. So just the 2 for Western Australia. There's nothing wrong with case studies, except that I say except, so that means there's something wrong with them. That's not true. We just have to understand what a case study in this aspect is. Case study is an after-the-fact recollection or narrative of what the farmer believes has happened as a result of some changes. It's not necessarily, or almost certainly doesn't have the appropriate pre-measurements. It doesn't have the transitional measurements, and it doesn't have the post-measurements that allow for a robust evaluation of what has been changed and where we've ended up and what the system's like. The other point that I'd like to make there is that when we evaluate systems, we're not everybody has just the financial amount of cash in the back pocket as their driver, and we have to be aware of that when we're trying to do comparisons of systems. So in terms of long-term field trials, where do we start? We've got, how do you do the design? How do you do the comparisons? We've got what criteria can we use? Yields. Do we use the same crops? Do we apply equivalent fertilisers? When we're in different systems with a grazing fertiliser or grazing system with nutrients coming or nitrogen coming from legumes, do we top up the legumes or the nitrogen on the cereal crop in the conventional, or do we, it's questions after questions as to what the appropriate system is, because I could very quickly say that if you have a mostly or a rotation system with animals in, we may well want to grow a different variety of wheat compared to one that's in a 4-year rotation with canola and barley, for example, because just of the different aspects of there. What sort of measures do we use for sustainability? Do we use, and for what sort of measures for soil quality? We know that some of the measurements that can relate to soil quality are very slow to change. Anyone that tells that the organic matter content or organic carbon content has changed by several % in a matter of months is really just subject to a misrepresentation in the sampling, I think. We know that it just doesn't build up in that way. I guess you've read the comment about the reduction of science, and science does have to break it down into individual things, and we're trying to look at a system. So how do we just tackle that? There are a myriad of different designs that can be used. I'm a strong advocate that if we are doing systems analysis and that includes rotations, we should be having every phase of that rotation represented every year, because each phase may be affected differently by seasonal conditions. So if we miss a year that was good for canola and put it in a year that was bad for canola, we might really knock that system, and it's just a matter of not trying to, we need to have every crop in every year, which of course increases the size of the study area or the way that we look at things dramatically if you take a conventional approach to setting up the trials. Soil types are variable. The bigger you get, the more variable you get and likely to pick that up. And I've talked about nitrogen supply. And we will also have face some hurdles to jump in terms of animal ethics, in terms of having grazing animals within a trial. They're going to have to be properly looked after, and that increases the amount of effort and investment into the system. So I think I'm drawing towards the end, and I'm very keen to open to discussion. We know that our farmers, and we've heard about it in the last couple of days, they're keen and quick to adopt things that have been demonstrated to them that are better for a number of different reasons. Take controlled traffic for the moment, from the photograph there. 2 centimetre guidance 10 years ago, that wasn't even a factor. Paddocks were still being sown round and round. There was hardly any. And it was interesting to hear the talk on the precision agriculture. Once the machinery and the software and the maps and things all got consistent, the adoption has actually been very quick in Western Australia because of the size of our farms and because of the obvious gains in scale that we can have. So I think it's likely that we will show out of some of the upcoming studies that there are aspects that are quite beneficial, and I'm sure that those will be adopted and we'll end up with a system. But like I said at the beginning, I think we could be looking not at just what some people over here have said is regenerative practices. We should be designing systems that pick the best out of everything to make them the most profitable and sustainable, I guess. Sustainable is a difficult word, because you're either sustainable or you're not, and we know that nothing, if it stays the same, is sustainable. So it's a hard word to use, but I think ongoing profitability is probably a better terminology.